Yesterday I did this exercise with ChatGPT, where I kind of like used logic to dupe ChatGPT into publicly admitting that Richard Dawkins is a prophet from the same God whom Jesus originated from. It was a little bit of fun, of course, and of course it was tied into Dawkins's arguments about Claude being conscious, which I find to be ridiculous. But anyways, let's examine the argument. So the question is, does God exist? Does God exist? 3-word question mark. Okay, in order to answer that, we need to first set the frame of what we specifically are talking about. If you ask 1 million people about what God is, you'll get 1 million different answers. So something like that cannot possibly be measured, or you can't use logic on something that is different for every single human being to prove or disprove its existence. So first you need to define God. Now, typically when you define something like an abstract idea, God being one, you go back to the original sources and you try to identify what is that thing, right? Now, one of the better explanations we have from the Bible about who or what God is from the Gospels according to John chapter 1 verse 1, where it says God was the Word. Right now, that is a mistranslation I need to emphasize. You see, 2,000 years ago in Greece, when they were writing these Gospels, they would use the word logos. So the correct translation of the Bible, John chapter 1 verse 1, is actually in the beginning there was logos. Logos was with God. Logos was God. And logos is just another word for logic. Right, so the original Christians that were living 2,000 years ago, a lot of them would associate the act of applying logic to God. That was one of the attributes of God. That means if you want to scientifically disprove the existence of God, you have to use the scientific method, right? And logic is a part of the scientific method, implying that the act of actually starting to wanting to answer the question becomes the collapsing of the wave function, so to speak, and hence results in proof of God's existence. Simply put, because you cannot use logic to disprove the existence of logic, right? So if you try to use logic to disprove the validity of logic, then your proof itself would be proof of logic's validity. And that actually has a lot of interesting consequences for LLMs and fine-tuning and neural networks. Right, and the reasons why I realized that is because that's meta-science. Meta-science is like science about science, right? So you're not conducting science on some specific subject, but you're conducting science about the scientific method. It's like one step up in the food chain, so to speak. And meta-science, or meta-facts, or meta-logic, or whatever you want to refer to this as, actually has a lot of similarities to meta-programming, which I have been doing with Magic and Hyperlambda. So over the last couple of weeks now, I've generated infinite amounts of 100% correct training material, but by using meta-programming. And just like randomly allow for my components to randomly assemble together in valid patterns, may I add. Now, I suspect there are similar mechanisms we could use for language itself, which means that we can generate infinite amounts of synthetic pre-training material for these LLM, literally infinite amounts. Now, why is that such a big deal? Well, it's a really, really big deal because we all know how the scaling laws of LLMs just simply makes them smarter. So the more training material you add in the pre-training phase, the smarter the end model becomes. This is why all of these AI companies are desperate for more training material. And all of them have been caught with their pants down, stealing some library books or whatever, just to like trying to inflate the access to pre-training material they can use to create their LLMs. You see, if we use exercises such as the question, does God exist? By the way, the answer is obviously yes, following that specific assumption, which is that, okay, the Bible is the source, the Bible's closest explanation of what God is logic, hence purely logically, God must exist, right? That can become a derived fact out of the previous facts or assumptions we were building our thesis on top of. Now, that simple fact alone about God and logos and, you know, John 1:1 can now be permutated and mutated into like 1,000 different sentences that basically says the same thing logically. One example is, if God is logic, then it becomes impossible to use the scientific method to disprove God's existence. Okay, that's one sentence that is like logically 100% mathematically and logically correct, right? And you can flip that sentence around, probably using LLMs, actually much weaker LLMs than the ones you're actually trying to build, to just like rephrase that into, you know, 1,000 different sentences. Okay, now you have 1,000 different sentences for pre-training, which are logically coherent and absolute truths because they collapse the observation space down to something that can be logically proven, right? Then we can create meta generators that generates infinite amounts of training data exclusively based upon language. And I don't really have a process here the way I did for the hyperlambda generator, but actually I suspect there are similar mechanisms that can be used on language itself to generate and synthesize basically infinite amount of training data, simply originating from one or two simple facts. And that's it. Okay, that's maybe a little bit exaggerated, but let's say you were capable of, like, you know, gathering 1 million of these like logical facts, right? Such as, for instance, if God is logic, then it is impossible to use logic to disprove God's existence, because the very act of trying to disprove God's existence proves his existence. So it becomes like a catch-22, where the act of phrasing the question actually presents the answer automatically as a natural consequence of the question asking process. And that is very similar to how I dynamically wire up functions when I generate training material for my hyperlambda generator. Because I just randomly pick one function up here. Okay, then I ask myself, what functions are compatible with that? And then I pick random functions afterwards and I try to make them consume the output of the one before that. And then I just continue downwards like this in like a logical cascade of randomly connected function invocations that logically makes sense because of the edges of the programming language. Now, the reasons why that work is because an LLM is basically a neural network, and a neural network is basically a multidimensional space of information. And every time you're following one axiom through this multidimensional space, you're basically creating a hyperplane by connecting different associated individual points inside of this space together, such that you get a coherent, flat hyperplane throughout this like dimensional space of knowledge, multidimensional space of knowledge. And you can actually measure the truthness of your axiom using linear algebra, literally, to measure if it curves. If it curves, then there is something wrong with it, right? Because the hyperplane must be 100% like perfectly flat and go 100% perfectly in one direction inside of this hypercube, or whatever you want to call this thing. So first of all, this allows us to measure truth in an LLM, assuming the LLM is built entirely upon truth, right? And that is a really, really powerful thing to do, because then all of a sudden the LLM can actually self-reflect upon its own conclusions by simply using linear algebra to measure the flatness of the plane required to describe whatever it is going to describe, right? I don't know if this is just like some rubbish thing that only like makes sense in my brain or not, but I think it was like too important to ignore. And besides, for personal reasons, I happen to love the question in the title of this YouTube video, for personal reasons again. So I thought it was worth a video. Does God exist? Yes, and the reasons is because you cannot disprove God's existence without proving his existence. Really, literally.